The champagne flute slipped from Victoria Hartwell's manicured fingers as I stepped through the gallery doors. Her laughter died mid-breath. The room didn't just go quiet. It went dead. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. The silk of my gown caught the light like liquid diamond, each step echoing against marble floors that suddenly felt like a courtroom. 3 months ago, she'd called me donation bin chic in front of everyone at this exact venue. She'd made sure the entire room heard it, made sure they laughed, made sure I understood that girls like me, scholarship girls with thrift store cardigans and secondhand dreams, didn't belong in their world of trust funds and summer homes in the Hamptons. But tonight, I wasn't wearing thrift store anything. Tonight, I was wearing Valentino Haute Couture, the kind you don't buy, the kind you get invited to wear, the kind that makes billionaires' daughters look twice and art collectors whisper your name like a prayer. Victoria's face had gone pale, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and rage. Her friends, the same ones who'd giggled behind their hands that night, now stared at me like I'd just walked out of their worst nightmare. Because I had. But none of them knew the truth. They didn't know who'd sent the car. They didn't know whose arm I'd be on tonight. And they definitely didn't know that everything they'd built their cruelty on was about to crumble. What happened next still keeps me awake at night. But not from fear, from satisfaction. It happened at the spring exhibition gala, 3 months earlier. I'd saved for weeks to afford the entry ticket. Not because I wanted to network with people who'd never see me as an equal, but because the artist being featured was my thesis subject. I needed to be there. My entire graduate program depended on it. I'd worn my best outfit. A cream cardigan my grandmother had knit before she died. A simple black dress from Goodwill that actually fit well. And the pearl earrings my mother had given me for my college graduation. I thought I looked respectable. Professional. I was wrong about what mattered to them. Victoria found me standing alone near the Rothko piece, taking notes. She'd appeared like a perfume-scented storm, flanked by 3 other women in designer everything. Their dresses probably cost more than my entire year's rent. They looked at me the way you'd look at a stain on expensive carpet. That's when I should have left. "Oh my God," Victoria had said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Is this a charity event? I didn't realize they were letting in scholarship cases tonight." Her friends had erupted in laughter. The kind that cuts. The kind designed to make you feel small enough to disappear. I'd tried to ignore her, tried to focus on my notes. But Victoria wasn't done. She'd circled me like a shark, pointing out every detail of my outfit. "Donation bin chic," she'd called it. "How brave of you to show up looking like someone's former housemaid. Really, it's inspiring." The cruelty in her voice was surgical, precise. The curator had been watching. Other guests had been watching. No one said a word. No one defended me. They just watched as Victoria systematically destroyed my dignity, piece by piece, in front of an audience that found it entertaining. I felt invisible and exposed at the same time. I'd left before the tears could fall, left my research half finished, left my dignity scattered across that marble floor like broken glass. I'd walked 12 blocks home in the rain because I couldn't afford a cab, and I'd sworn I'd never go back to that world. That was 3 months ago. I'd been certain I'd never see those people again, but life had other plans. And so did someone I hadn't even met yet. My name is Emma Rivera, and I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens with my mother and younger brother. Mom worked double shifts at Mount Sinai Hospital, breakfast service at 6 a.m., cleaning crew until midnight. I learned early that invisible people keep the world running while visible people take the credit. School was my escape. Books were my passport. I'd win every scholarship, ace every test, earn every opportunity through sheer force of will. But there's a difference between earning your way in and belonging. I learned that the hard way at Columbia. The other students came from families with lake houses and ski chalets. I worked 3 jobs while finishing my master's thesis in art history. Morning shift at a coffee shop near campus, afternoons cataloging pieces for a private collection, evenings tutoring wealthy undergrads who'd never know what it felt like to choose between textbooks and dinner. My advisor once told me I had the sharpest mind she'd seen in 20 years. But sharp minds don't pay rent. They don't buy the kind of clothes that make gallery curators take you seriously. They don't open doors that are locked from the inside. I'd accepted my place. The girl who works harder, earns less, and remains invisible while others shine. I thought that was just how the world worked. Then I met Marcus Ashford, and everything I thought I understood about power, worth, and visibility turned out to be wrong. The private collection I cataloged belonged to the Ashford estate. I'd been hired through an agency. They needed someone to document a recent acquisition of mid-century modern pieces. It was supposed to be a 3-week job. I was supposed to never meet the owner. That's not how it played out. Marcus Ashford was the kind of wealthy that didn't need to announce itself. His family's name was on museum wings and university buildings. At 42, he'd turned his inheritance into an empire: tech investments, sustainable energy, art foundations. Forbes called him a kingmaker. I called him Mr. Ashford and tried to stay invisible. He'd found me in the West Gallery on my second week, standing in front of a Mark Rothko that had just been authenticated. I hadn't heard him approach. I'd been too absorbed, too caught up in the way the colors seemed to breathe. "You're seeing it differently than the appraiser did," he'd said. His voice was quiet, certain. I'd nearly dropped my tablet, stammered an apology, tried to explain I was just doing my job. But he'd stepped closer, studying not the painting but my reaction to it. "Tell me what you see," he'd said. Not a command, an invitation. So I did. I told him about the layering technique Rothko used in his later period. I explained how this piece was from 1969, painted during his darkest depression, how you could see the weight of that darkness in the way the crimson seemed to sink into itself. How it wasn't just a painting, but a feeling made visible. Marcus had listened like my words mattered, like I mattered. When I finished, he'd nodded slowly. "The appraiser called it significant. You called it what it actually is, a masterpiece of human suffering transformed into something transcendent." He'd paused. "I'm going to need you to stay on longer. The collection needs someone who actually sees it." That's when I should have known. That's when I should have realized that Marcus Ashford didn't just collect art. He collected truth. And somehow, without meaning to, I'd shown him mine. I had no idea this moment would change everything. Working for Marcus changed something fundamental. Not because he paid well, though he did, but because he treated competence like it mattered more than pedigree. In his world, what you knew outweighed who your parents were. Over the next 2 months, I cataloged his entire modern collection. But more than that, I learned. He'd ask my opinion on acquisitions, invite me to authentication meetings, introduce me to curators and collectors as the specialist, without mentioning my age or background. I didn't realize he was rebuilding me, not my appearance or my clothes, my belief that I belonged in rooms where decisions worth millions were made. The invitation came 6 weeks after I'd started. Marcus needed someone to attend the summer gala at the Metropolitan. Same venue as my humiliation. Different event. His usual consultant had canceled. He'd asked if I could fill in, represent his foundation, provide insight on the pieces being auctioned. I'd said no. Told him I wasn't the right fit. Didn't have the wardrobe, the connections, the background. He'd looked at me with that steady, unreadable expression he had when he was about to say something that would change everything. "Victoria Hartwell will be there," he'd said quietly. "She's on the junior board. I'm told she's made it her mission to ensure certain people feel unwelcome at these events." He'd paused. "I'm also told you're one of those people." My face must have betrayed me. He'd known. Somehow he'd known about that night, about the humiliation, about donation bin cheek and every cruel word. "You don't have to go," Marcus had continued. "But if you do, you go as my guest. Not as someone asking for permission to exist in that space, as someone who belongs there more than any of them." He'd handed me a business card. "This is my stylist. She'll call you tomorrow. Everything's handled. All you have to do is show up." I'd stared at that card for 3 days before I called. And when I finally did, I wasn't doing it for Marcus. I wasn't even doing it for revenge. I was doing it for the girl who'd walked 12 blocks in the rain believing she deserved to be invisible. But I had no idea the real storm was just beginning. The Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the Metropolitan Museum at exactly 8:45 p.m. I watched through tinted windows as the crowd turned, expecting someone important. They had no idea how right they were. Marcus sat beside me, calm as still water. "Remember," he'd said, "you're not here to prove anything. You're here because you've already proven everything." The door opened. The evening air hit my skin. I stepped out, and time seemed to fracture. The gown was Valentino Haute Couture, custom fitted over 3 appointments I still couldn't believe had happened. Midnight blue silk that moved like smoke, hand embroidered with constellations of crystals that caught every camera flash. It wasn't just a dress, it was a statement. It was armor. It was everything I'd never let myself dream of wearing. My hair was styled in a classic chignon by the same team that prepped Oscar nominees. My jewelry, on loan from Cartier, was worth more than my childhood apartment building. But none of that was what made people stare. It was the way I moved, the way I carried myself like I'd been born in marble halls instead of scratching my way toward them, the way Marcus offered his arm, and I took it like we were equals, because in that moment, we were. The crowd parted. Whispers started like wildfire. "Who is that? Is that Marcus Ashford? Who's the woman?" We climbed the stairs. Each step felt like walking through water. Everything moving in slow motion except my heartbeat. And then I saw her. Victoria stood near the entrance, champagne in hand, surrounded by her usual circle of privilege. She'd been laughing at something, her head thrown back in that practiced way wealthy girls learn. Then she saw me. The champagne flute slipped. The laughter died. Her face went through 5 emotions in 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, shock, rage, fear. I didn't smile. Didn't acknowledge her. Just walked past like she was part of the architecture. Invisible, irrelevant, nothing. Marcus leaned in as we entered the gallery. "Well done," he whispered. "Now let's show them what you actually came here for." And that's when the real show began. The whispers hit like a wave. I could feel them, not hear them, feel them, as Marcus and I moved through the gallery. Every conversation we passed stuttered. Every group we approached suddenly found their champagne fascinating. Caroline Preston Ward, old money from Connecticut, actually grabbed her husband's arm when she recognized me. Her mouth formed a perfect O of shock. She'd been there that night. She'd laughed the loudest when Victoria called me donation bin chic. Now she watched me standing next to Marcus Ashford, like I'd personally rewritten the social order. Because in a way, I had. The younger socialites were worse. They'd built their entire identities on exclusion. Seeing me cross that threshold didn't just confuse them. It threatened the fundamental logic of their existence. Victoria kept her distance, but I could see her circling, shark-like, talking rapidly to her friends, pointing, planning. She'd recovered from her initial shock and moved into damage control. But Marcus was a master of social warfare fought with manners instead of weapons. He introduced me to the museum director as Dr. Chen's most promising doctoral candidate and my lead acquisition consultant. He made sure every board member knew I'd authenticated 3 pieces in their permanent collection. He positioned me not as his date, but as his colleague. By 9:30, curators were asking my opinion. Collectors were requesting my card. A tech mogul's wife wanted to know if I'd consult on their private collection. I wasn't just in the room anymore. I was becoming the room. Then the deputy director approached with a question about the Rothko being auctioned. I explained the provenance issue I'd discovered in my research. a detail that would have been devastating if it emerged after purchase. The room went silent as I spoke. Not polite silence. The kind of silence that means people are actually listening. When I finished, the deputy director looked at Marcus with something like awe. "Where on earth did you find her?" Marcus smiled. "I didn't find her. I just stopped overlooking her." That's when Victoria made her move. She appeared at my elbow with 2 other junior board members, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "How fascinating," she said. "I didn't realize Marcus's foundation was hiring such diverse consultants." The word diverse dripped with implication. She'd loaded it with everything she meant but couldn't say. Poor, unqualified, out-of-place charity case. Marcus went very still beside me. I could feel the temperature drop. But before he could respond, I turned to Victoria with a smile that could have frozen champagne. "Diverse?" I said calmly. "No. Competent. But I understand how those concepts might seem interchangeable to someone who's never had to be either." Her face went white. Her friends gasped. And somewhere in the back of the gallery, someone started to clap. That's when the real truth began to surface. And Victoria's nightmare was only beginning. The deputy director cleared his throat. "Actually, Victoria, there's something you should know." He looked uncomfortable, like he'd been dreading this moment. "We've been conducting an internal review of acquisition recommendations from the junior board." Victoria's smile froze. "I'm sorry?" "3 pieces you championed last year," the director continued, his voice professionally neutral, but his eyes hard. "The Basquiat drawing, the contemporary sculpture, and the photography series. All 3 have been flagged." The crowd around us had grown. People sensed blood in the water. In rooms like this, scandal was currency. "Flagged for what?" Victoria's voice had gone high, defensive. Marcus stepped forward, his phone in hand. "For being part of a resale scheme involving your family's private gallery." He turned the screen so others could see. Documents, emails, transaction records. "You recommended the museum overpay for pieces your father's gallery had purchased at much lower prices months earlier. The museum lost nearly $3 million. Your family's gallery made substantial profits." The silence was absolute. I watched Victoria's face cycle through denial, fury, and calculation. She'd been caught. "That's..." she started, but Marcus wasn't finished. "I have correspondence showing you knew the true values. You deliberately misrepresented the pieces to the board." He pocketed his phone. "The museum's legal team received these documents this morning. I imagine they'll want to have a conversation with you very soon." Caroline Preston Ward stepped back from Victoria like she was contagious. The tech mogul's wife whispered something to her husband. The museum director looked like he wanted to sink through the marble floor. But Marcus still wasn't done. He turned to me. "She discovered the discrepancies while researching authentication records. She brought them to my attention 3 weeks ago." Every eye in the gallery turned to me. I hadn't just crashed their party. I'd exposed their fraud. I wasn't the charity case anymore. I was the threat. Victoria's face had gone from white to red. "You," she hissed at me, all pretense of civility abandoned. "You did this because I made one little comment about your cheap clothes." "No," I interrupted, my voice steady. "I did this because fraud is fraud, regardless of what the perpetrator thinks about my wardrobe. The fact that you can't see the difference is exactly why you shouldn't be near a museum board." Someone in the crowd actually laughed. Not cruel laughter, appreciative laughter. Victoria looked around desperately, searching for allies. But the crowd had already made their verdict. In their world, getting caught was worse than the crime, and she'd gotten caught spectacularly. "You're done," I said quietly, just for her. "Not because of me, because of you." And then I walked away. By the next morning, Victoria Hartwell's name was toxic. The museum released a statement announcing her immediate removal from the junior board pending investigation. Her father's gallery issued a panicked denial that fooled exactly no one. But the social consequences moved faster than any legal proceedings. That's how it works in their world. Reputation is everything, and Victoria's had been demolished in a single evening. Caroline Preston Ward publicly resigned from 2 committees they'd shared, citing ethical concerns. The charity Victoria chaired suddenly discovered irregularities in their records and asked her to step down. Invitations were quietly revoked. Group chats went silent when her name appeared. I watched it happen from a distance, through the grapevine of gallery assistants and museum staff who suddenly wanted to be my friend. There was a savage efficiency to it. The same people who'd laughed at her cruelty now competed to distance themselves from her fastest. Marcus forwarded me an email without comment. Victoria's father's gallery was under investigation by the New York Attorney General's office. What started as museum fraud had uncovered a larger pattern of price manipulation and misrepresentation. Her social media went dark. Her carefully curated Instagram disappeared overnight. The PR firm her family hired couldn't stop the bleeding because the evidence was ironclad and the source was unimpeachable. The woman who'd built her identity on exclusion now found herself excluded. The woman who'd weaponized belonging now belonged nowhere. The woman who'd mocked my cheap clothes was discovering that integrity can't be bought. 3 weeks after the gala, I received a letter. Victoria's handwriting, expensive stationery, probably written by her lawyer. An apology, carefully worded to admit nothing that could be used against her in court. It acknowledged her inappropriate comments and hoped we could move past this misunderstanding. I read it once, then filed it away. Some people apologize because they're sorry. Others apologize because they're caught. Victoria's letter fell firmly in the second category. I felt no joy in watching her fall, but I felt no guilt either. Justice isn't always clean. Sometimes it's just necessary. But her fall wasn't the end of my story. Dr. Chen called me into her office on a Tuesday morning. She handed me a letter. "The Ashford Foundation is endowing a new position," she said, watching my face carefully. "Research Fellow in Modern Art Authentication. Full funding, 3 years, with access to private collections worldwide. Marcus Ashford specifically requested you for the role." I stared at the letter, the words blurring. This wasn't just a job. This was a career, a future, a door opening so wide I could see my entire life stretching out beyond it. "There's one condition," Dr. Chen continued. "You have to actually accept it." He was very clear that this isn't charity. It's recognition of expertise he'd be foolish not to support. I took the position, and with it, my world transformed. Within 6 months, I'd authenticated pieces for 3 major collectors, identified 2 forgeries before they reached auction, and published research that changed attribution for an entire series of mid-century works. My name started appearing in art journals. Gallery owners returned my calls. The Metropolitan invited me to join their Young Professionals Advisory Board, the position Victoria had been forced to vacate. I accepted, with the understanding that every recommendation I made would be transparent and documented. They didn't just agree, they implemented it as policy. Marcus and I remained colleagues, nothing more. He'd simply opened a door and stepped aside. The real victory came 6 months after the gala. I was invited to speak at the annual Art Historians Conference, the same conference where I'd been too intimidated to even ask questions during panels. I stood on that stage in front of 800 professionals and delivered my paper on authentication methodology and contemporary art fraud. When I finished, the applause lasted so long the moderator had to gently interrupt for questions. A young woman approached me afterward. She was maybe 22, wearing a cardigan that had clearly been mended several times, carrying a notebook instead of an iPad. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for showing us we don't have to disappear." I looked at her and saw myself 3 years ago. The girl who'd thought invisible was the same as safe. Who'd believed that people like us were meant to watch, not participate. You were never invisible, I told her. They just convinced you that you were. Don't make that mistake again. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and walked away a little straighter. That's when I understood what Marcus had known all along. Power isn't about having the most money or the right last name. It's about refusing to accept someone else's definition of your worth. Sometimes I still walk past the Metropolitan at night, watching people arrive for events I could attend now if I wanted. I don't always go. I've learned that access isn't the same as obligation. Marcus told me once that the best revenge is evolution. That the people who tried to keep you small will always be trapped in the moment they underestimated you. He was right. Victoria Hartwell is still fighting legal battles, still trying to rebuild a reputation that's permanently fractured. Caroline Preston Ward still circles the same social events, growing older in a world that values youth and novelty above loyalty. They're frozen in their own cruelty, preserved like insects in amber. But I've become someone they never saw coming. Not because I changed who I was, but because I stopped accepting their version of who I should be. The cardigan my grandmother knit still hangs in my closet. I wear it sometimes when I'm working late, surrounded by multi-million-dollar art and authentication equipment. It reminds me where I came from. More importantly, it reminds me that my worth was never determined by how expensive my clothes were. They tried to bury me with humiliation. They tried to make me disappear with cruelty. They tried to convince me that girls from Queens with thrift store cardigans don't belong in marble halls and gallery openings. But they didn't know something crucial. They didn't know I was never the girl they thought they were burying. I was the storm they never saw gathering. And by the time they realized their mistake, I was already inside their walls, reshaping the world they thought they owned. Some people are born into power. Others are born for it. I learned I was the latter, and that made all the difference. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe for more billionaire twist stories where the underestimated become unstoppable.